Hey everyone, welcome back to True Stories with Mark. I'm Mark, and if you're new here, this is the place where we dive into real stories, real people, and the moments that changed everything. Some of these stories will surprise you. Some will break your heart. Some will make you question everything you thought you knew about the people around you. Is stranger than anything you could make up. Before we get into today's story, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next one. All right, let's get into it.
David Whitman met Robert Hayes in college, back when neither of them had $2 to rub together. They were roommates in a cramped dorm at a state university in Ohio, both business majors, both hungry for something bigger than the small towns they'd grown up in. David was the dreamer of the two, full of ideas, always sketching business plans on napkins at 2 in the morning. Robert was the pragmatist, the one who could take David's wild ideas and figure out how to actually make the numbers work. "I can't do this without someone who understands the finance side better than I do," David told him over beers one night. Robert didn't hesitate. He quit his stable job at a regional bank and joined David as an equal partner, 50-50, in a business they built from a garage office with 2 folding tables and a single landline phone. Back in college, the two of them made an unlikely pair. David was the kind of student who'd rather sketch out a hypothetical business model on the back of a syllabus than actually study for the exam that syllabus was describing. He failed his first accounting class entirely, not because he didn't understand the material, but because he'd spent the semester obsessing over a business plan for a food truck that never actually launched. Robert, by contrast, kept meticulous notes, color-coded by subject, and had already landed a summer internship at a regional bank by their sophomore year. They should have had nothing in common, and yet somehow they became inseparable. David bringing the ideas, Robert bringing the discipline to actually evaluate whether those ideas made financial sense. There was a running joke between them in those years. David would come home from a late class buzzing about some new idea, a subscription box service, an app for splitting restaurant bills, a food truck, always a food truck, and Robert would calmly ask 3 or 4 pointed financial questions that would usually deflate the idea within about 90 seconds. "You're going to be the death of every good idea I ever have," David used to tell him, half joking, half serious. Robert would just shrug and say, "Better I kill it now for free than a bank kills it later and charges you interest for the privilege." It was that dynamic, more than any grand strategic vision, that convinced David he needed Robert as a partner when he finally launched the freight brokerage years later. He didn't need another dreamer. He needed someone who could tell him, honestly and without flattery, when an idea was good enough to bet the mortgage on and when it wasn't. After graduation, they stayed close, and 8 years later, when David finally scraped together enough courage and enough savings to start his own company, a logistics and freight brokerage firm based out of Columbus, he called Robert first. David met Sarah around the same period he was building out that first real office. She worked reception at the business park, greeting a rotating cast of small business owners and their harried employees every morning with the same unshakable good humor, regardless of how her own day was going. David noticed her within his first week in the building, mostly because she was the only person who seemed to remember every visitor's name after a single introduction, including his. Their first real conversation happened over a broken coffee machine in the shared break room. David had been trying, unsuccessfully, to coax a cup out of a jam dispenser for nearly 5 minutes, muttering under his breath, when Sarah walked over, hit the machine once in a very specific spot with the heel of her hand, and it started working immediately. "Everyone in this building thinks I have some kind of magic touch with that thing," she told him, laughing at his stunned expression. "Really, I just know which screw is loose." He asked her to dinner 3 days later. She said yes, on the condition that he actually show up wearing something other than the wrinkled button-down he seemed to live in at the office. He showed up in a suit that, in retrospect, he'd clearly rented for the occasion and never quite fit him right in the shoulders. And Sarah teased him about it for years afterward. It became something of a private joke between them, a piece of shared history from back when everything between them still felt easy and uncomplicated. Within a year, they were married in a small ceremony at her parents' backyard in a suburb of Cleveland, string lights hanging between the trees, 40 guests, a rented tent in case of rain. The early years of the marriage mirrored the early years of the business. Lean, uncertain, but full of hope. David worked constantly, often sleeping at the office when a shipment crisis needed handling at 3 in the morning. Sarah supported him through it, picking up extra shifts of her own, keeping their small apartment running, telling him again and again that all the sacrifice would be worth it once the business found its footing. And it did find its footing, eventually. By their 5th wedding anniversary, Whitman and Hayes Logistics had grown from 2 guys in a garage to a company with 40 employees and contracts with several mid-sized manufacturers across the Midwest. David and Sarah moved into a proper house, a modest colonial in a good school district outside Columbus, in anticipation of the family they hoped to start. Sarah cut back her hours, then eventually stopped working altogether when their son Ethan was born. Life for a while looked exactly like the future David had sketched on those late-night napkins all those years earlier. Nobody grows a business in a straight line, and Whitman and Hayes was no exception. Around Ethan's 4th birthday, the freight industry took a significant hit. Fuel costs spiked, a couple of their biggest manufacturing clients relocated production overseas, and a regional competitor undercut their rates aggressively to steal market share. David and Robert weathered the first year of the downturn by cutting costs wherever they could. Laying off a handful of employees, David and Robert both taking pay cuts to keep the company afloat. But the second year was worse. A client that represented nearly a third of their annual revenue declared bankruptcy and defaulted on almost $200,000 in outstanding invoices. The company had taken out a line of credit to cover payroll during the lean months, expecting that revenue to come in, and when it didn't, the hole got deeper fast. David started missing dinners at home, then missing entire weekends, buried in spreadsheets trying to find some way to keep the doors open without laying off the core team that had been with them since the early days. Sarah noticed the strain, of course. Money got tighter at home too. They stopped taking the annual family vacation, started clipping coupons again, the kind of small austerities that add up and wear on a marriage over time. She remembered with a kind of bitter clarity years later, the specific moment she realized just how bad things had gotten. She'd gone to use their joint credit card at the grocery store, and it had been declined, quietly, embarrassingly, in front of a line of other shoppers. She'd had to call David from the parking lot, her voice tight with a mixture of humiliation and fear, and he'd apologized so many times over the phone that she'd almost felt worse for him than for herself. David tried to shield her from the worst of it at first, not wanting to worry her, but eventually the numbers were too big to hide, and he sat her down at the kitchen table one night and explained just how serious the situation had become. He laid out the spreadsheets in front of her, something he'd never done before, having always kept the business finances separate from their household life, a habit Sarah would later come to resent, feeling that she'd been kept in the dark during the very years when she most needed to understand what was happening. "We might lose the house," he told her, his voice cracking in a way she'd never heard from him before. "I don't know yet. Robert and I are trying everything, but it's bad, Sarah. It's really bad." Sarah didn't say much that night. She nodded. She held his hand across the table. She said the words a wife is supposed to say, that they'd get through it together, that things would work out. But something in her had already begun to shift, even if neither of them recognized it yet. The confident, ambitious man she'd married, the one who always seemed to have a plan, now looked exhausted and uncertain in a way that unsettled her more than the missing money did. In the weeks that followed, David withdrew further into work, not out of neglect, but out of a desperate, single-minded need to fix what was breaking. He started leaving before Ethan woke up and coming home after he was already asleep, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. Sarah, left alone with a 4-year-old and a mounting sense of dread about their financial future, found herself increasingly isolated. Her own friendships had thinned out over the years of prioritizing David's business and their family, and she had few people to turn to when the walls of her own life felt like they were closing in. She tried more than once to talk to David about how alone she felt, but those conversations always seemed to circle back to the business. A new complication with a client, a new demand from the bank, a new crisis that needed his full attention right that moment. Sarah began to feel, unfairly or not, like she and Ethan had become secondary to the company, an afterthought squeezed into whatever emotional bandwidth David had left over after a 16-hour day. While David was drowning in the operational side of the crisis, chasing down late payments, negotiating with the bank for an extended credit line, trying to retain their remaining clients, Robert had taken on a different role. As the numbers guy, he was the one who dealt directly with the company's financial advisors and increasingly with the family finances too, since David simply didn't have the bandwidth anymore. It started innocently enough. Robert would stop by the house to drop off paperwork David needed to sign or to pick something up when David was stuck at a client meeting. Sarah, exhausted from managing a 4-year-old alone most days while her husband worked around the clock, found herself talking to Robert more and more. Not about anything improper, at least not at first, just venting about how hard things had gotten, how distant David felt even when he was physically home. Robert, for his part, listened. He always had a way of making people feel heard. It was part of what made him good at his job, the ability to sit across from a nervous banker or a frustrated client and make them feel like their concerns were being genuinely taken seriously. He brought that same quality to his conversations with Sarah, and over the months, as the business crisis dragged on and David grew more consumed by it, those conversations began to fill a space in Sarah's life that David, however unintentionally, had left empty. One afternoon in particular stood out to Sarah later, when she tried to trace back the moment things had truly started to shift. Robert had come by to pick up some signed documents David had left for him and found Sarah in the backyard near tears, trying to fix a broken swing set that Ethan had been begging her to repair for weeks, one that David had promised to fix himself but never found the time for. Robert, without being asked, took off his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and spent the next hour helping her fix it, asking nothing in return, seeming genuinely happy just to be useful. "You don't have to do everything yourself, you know," he told her afterward, as they sat on the back porch steps, both a little sweaty from the effort, Ethan happily testing out the newly repaired swing a few feet away. "David's lucky to have you holding all of this together while he's dealing with the business. I hope he knows that." It was a small comment, but it landed somewhere deep in Sarah, an acknowledgement of her invisible labor that she'd been quietly craving from David for months, without realizing how much she needed to hear it from someone. Neither of them, if you asked Sarah later, set out to betray David. That's what she'd tell herself anyway in the months and years that followed. It happened gradually. A lingering conversation on the porch after Robert dropped off documents, a lunch that was supposed to be about business logistics, but somehow became personal. A moment where Robert reached out and squeezed her hand while she cried about how alone she felt. And neither of them pulled away as quickly as they should have. There was a particular lunch about 4 months before everything finally came apart that Sarah would later identify in quiet moments of honesty with herself as the point of no return. Robert had suggested meeting to go over some paperwork David needed reviewed, but the paperwork sat untouched on the table between them for the better part of 2 hours while they talked instead about everything else. Her abandoned marketing degree, his own quiet regrets about never having started a family of his own, the strange parallel loneliness they'd both been carrying without realizing the other person felt it too. When the check came, Robert reached for her hand across the table, not romantically at first, just as a gesture of comfort, and Sarah didn't pull away. She would spend a long time afterward wondering whether that was the moment she should have. By the time David's business crisis reached its most desperate point, the bank threatening to call the loan, the real possibility of the company folding entirely and taking their house and savings down with it, Sarah and Robert had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The final blow to the business came on a Tuesday in March. The bank, after months of extensions, formally called the loan and gave David and Robert 30 days to either pay the outstanding balance in full or face foreclosure on the company's assets, including the small warehouse they'd purchased years earlier during better times. David spent that entire month in a blur, meeting with lawyers, meeting with potential investors who ultimately passed, trying every angle he could think of to save 11 years of work. He barely slept during those 30 days, running on coffee and a kind of desperate adrenaline, convinced that if he just worked hard enough, found the right investor, made the right phone call, he could still pull the company back from the edge. What David didn't know during those frantic 30 days was that Robert had already quietly begun preparing for a different outcome. Using his financial expertise and his closer relationship with the company's outside accountant, Robert had spent several weeks restructuring his own personal financial exposure to the business, a series of technically legal but ethically murky maneuvers that would leave him considerably better protected than David once the bankruptcy proceedings actually began. He never mentioned any of this to David directly, framing his late nights with the accountant as simply trying to find a way out for both of them, when in reality he was quietly building himself an exit. He came home that final night, the night the deadline passed with no resolution, the night the company officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, utterly hollowed out. He'd lost the business. Not just a job, but the thing he'd built from nothing, the thing that represented every sacrifice he and Sarah had made for over a decade. He walked into the house expecting, at the very least, his wife's comfort. What he found instead was Sarah sitting at the kitchen table with a suitcase already packed by the door. "David, we need to talk," she said. And something in her voice told him immediately that this wasn't going to be a conversation about the bankruptcy. She told him everything that night, about Robert, about how long it had been going on, about how she'd already made up her mind. She said the words that would replay in David's head for years afterward. "I can't do this anymore. I can't watch you lose everything and just wait around to see what's left when the dust settles. Robert has stability. He has a plan. I need that for Ethan, and honestly, I need it for myself." David stood there for a long moment, trying to process two devastating losses arriving within the same 24 hours, unable to fully absorb either one. "Robert," he finally said, almost laughing at the absurdity of it, a laugh with no humor in it at all. "My Robert, the guy who's been in our house every week for a year, helping with the swing set, bringing over documents. That Robert." "Don't make this harder than it already is," Sarah said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. "I'm not the one who made it hard, Sarah," David replied, his voice low and shaking. "I'm standing here having just lost the company I built with that man, and you're telling me you've been building something with him too, this whole time, behind my back, while I was trying to save us." Sarah didn't have a response to that. She simply picked up her suitcase, called for Ethan, who'd been watching television in the next room, oblivious to what was unfolding, and walked out the front door toward her sister's car, already waiting at the curb, which told David in one final gutting detail that this conversation had been planned, that Sarah had known exactly when she was going to leave, timed almost precisely to the moment David would come home, having lost everything else that mattered to him. David stood alone in his own kitchen, having just lost his company hours earlier, listening to the sound of his family's car pulling away from the curb outside, and understood in the space of a single evening that he had lost his business, his marriage, and very possibly the roof over his head all at once. The months that followed were the darkest of David's life. The bankruptcy proceedings dragged on, ultimately resulting in the liquidation of what remained of the company's assets to pay off creditors. Robert, through the arrangement of the original partnership agreement and some financial maneuvering that David was too depleted to fight in court, walked away with considerably less personal exposure than David did. Robert's name simply wasn't attached to as many of the company's later debts, a fact that still stung whenever David thought about it too long. The house was lost within 4 months, sold at a loss to cover the remaining balance on the line of credit. David moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store in a less desirable part of town. The kind of place he never imagined himself living, with thin walls and a leaking bathroom faucet he couldn't afford to fix. Custody arrangements for Ethan were settled relatively amicably, at least on paper, with David getting him every other weekend, though even that felt like a cruel joke some weeks, when David could barely afford groceries, let alone anything resembling the life Ethan had grown used to. David remembered one particular weekend visit during this period that haunted him for a long time afterward. He'd planned to take Ethan to the zoo, something they'd done together every summer for years, only to realize at the ticket counter that he didn't have enough in his account to cover admission for both of them. He'd had to quietly turn around, invent an excuse about the zoo being too crowded that day, and take Ethan to a free public park instead, forcing a cheerfulness he didn't remotely feel while his 4-year-old son remained blissfully unaware of the quiet financial catastrophe unfolding around him. David sat on a park bench that afternoon, watching Ethan play on the swings, and felt a shame so total it was almost physical. Not for being poor exactly, but for the gap between the father he wanted to be for his son and the one he currently had the resources to be. Worse than the financial devastation, though, was the isolation. Robert had been David's closest friend for nearly 2 decades before he became his business partner. Losing him wasn't just professional, it was personal, a betrayal that cut into the foundation of everything David thought he understood about loyalty and friendship. And losing Sarah, even though their marriage had clearly been fraying under the weight of the business crisis, still felt like losing the only home he'd known as an adult. There were nights in that thin-walled apartment when David genuinely didn't know how he was going to get through the next morning, let alone rebuild any kind of life. He'd sit on the edge of his secondhand mattress, staring at his phone, sometimes typing out messages to Sarah he never sent, sometimes just sitting in silence until the sun came up. He lost weight he didn't have to lose. He stopped returning calls from old friends, embarrassed by how far he'd fallen. For a while, it seemed entirely possible that David Whitman would simply disappear into that small, sad apartment and never find his way back out. He remembered one night in particular, maybe 6 weeks after Sarah left, when the hardware store below his apartment had its security alarm malfunction at around 2 in the morning, blaring relentlessly for nearly 20 minutes before someone finally came to shut it off. David had lain there in the dark, fully awake, staring at the water stain on his ceiling, and found himself thinking that the alarm was almost a relief, a noise loud enough finally to drown out the constant replay of that final conversation with Sarah that had been looping through his head every night since she left. He tried during those early weeks to reach out to a few old friends from before the business had consumed his entire life, but found himself unable to actually explain what had happened without breaking down partway through the conversation. Eventually, it became easier to simply stop answering the phone at all. His mother called every Sunday, faithfully, and he answered maybe 1 call in 3, giving her clipped, minimal updates that he knew weren't fooling her, but that she was kind enough not to push past. The lowest point came about 2 months in, on a night when David realized he'd forgotten to eat anything since the previous morning, not out of any deliberate choice, but simply because the thought hadn't occurred to him. He stood in his empty kitchen at nearly 10 at night, staring into a nearly bare refrigerator, and felt something inside him crack open. Not dramatically, not with tears, just a quiet, hollow recognition that he had completely lost track of how to take care of himself. He sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, and stayed there for a long time before finally ordering a pizza he barely tasted. The turning point, when it came, was small and unremarkable in the way most turning points actually are. Nothing like the dramatic epiphanies you see in movies. It happened on a Saturday morning, one of David's weekends with Ethan. His son, now 5 years old, was sitting across from him at the small kitchen table in the apartment, eating cereal, when he looked up and asked, with the blunt honesty only a child can manage, "Dad, are you sad all the time now?" David didn't have a good answer for him in the moment, but the question stayed with him for days afterward, gnawing at something underneath the numbness he'd been living in. He realized, sitting there with his son's cereal bowl clinking against the table, that he had a choice to make. Not about the business, not about Sarah, but about who he was going to be for Ethan going forward. He could keep sinking, or he could start climbing, one small step at a time. The first step was embarrassingly practical. David needed a job, any job, just to keep the lights on and make his child support payments. His industry contacts had mostly dried up. Bankruptcy has a way of making people cautious about your reliability, fair or not. So he took a position that felt like a significant step down from where he'd been, working as a dispatcher for a much smaller freight company across town, a job that paid a fraction of what he used to make running his own business. The interview for that dispatcher position was, in its own small way, one of the more humbling experiences of David's professional life. He sat across from a hiring manager roughly 15 years his junior, a man who had clearly done a cursory search on David's name and found news coverage of the bankruptcy, and who spent a good portion of the interview asking pointed, slightly skeptical questions about David's reliability and his reasons for applying to what was, by any measure, an entry to mid-level position for someone with his background. David answered honestly, without excuses, explaining simply that he needed steady work and was willing to start wherever he needed to in order to rebuild. A directness that seemed to catch the hiring manager off guard in a way that ultimately worked in David's favor. It stung that first month, clocking in and out for someone else after 11 years of being his own boss. David remembered vividly the first time a shift supervisor, half his age, corrected his dispatching approach in front of the rest of the team. A small, ordinary workplace moment that would have rolled off him easily in his old life, but that landed like a fresh humiliation during those raw early weeks. A reminder in miniature of exactly how far he'd fallen. He drove home that night and sat in his car in the parking lot of his apartment building for nearly 20 minutes before he could make himself go inside, working through the sting of it privately before facing anyone. But David noticed something unexpected as the weeks passed. The work itself, stripped of the crushing financial pressure of ownership, was almost peaceful. He was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of instinctive understanding of logistics and scheduling that had made his original business successful in the first place. His new manager noticed within the first 2 months and started giving him more responsibility, more complex accounts to manage. There was something almost meditative, David found, about simply doing the work well without the constant, gnawing background anxiety of whether the entire company might collapse if he made one wrong call. A kind of freedom and smallness he hadn't expected to find and hadn't known until he actually experienced it, how much he needed. By the 6th month, colleagues had started coming to David informally with questions on complicated routing problems, the kind of institutional knowledge that couldn't be taught from a manual, and David found a quiet satisfaction in being useful again, in mattering to the people around him for reasons that had nothing to do with ownership or status, simply because he was good at his job and willing to help. David also started seeing a therapist, something he'd never have considered in his old life, when admitting to needing help felt like admitting to weakness. His therapist, a calm, direct woman named Dr. Patricia Lang, helped him work through not just the anger at Robert and the grief over his marriage, but something deeper. The identity crisis of a man who had built his entire sense of self-worth around being a successful business owner and now had to figure out who he was without that title. Their early sessions were rough. David spent most of the first month simply reciting the facts of what had happened, almost like giving testimony, unable to access the emotion underneath the narrative. Dr. Lang was patient with this, never pushing too hard, but occasionally asking pointed questions that David found himself unable to easily deflect. "You keep describing what Robert and Sarah did," she said to him once, several weeks in. "I haven't heard you describe what you feel about it. Those are different things." That question sat with David for days. He realized, turning it over in his mind during his shifts at the new dispatcher job, that he'd been so focused on the mechanics of his downfall, the bankruptcy filing, the timeline of Sarah and Robert's affair, the specific financial maneuvers Robert had used to protect himself, that he'd never actually let himself sit with the raw feeling of having been betrayed by the two people he trusted most in the world. When he finally did, in one particularly difficult session, he cried for the first time since the divorce, an ugly, exhausted kind of crying that left him drained, but strangely lighter. "You are not the business you lost," she told him once, a line that David wrote down on a sticky note and kept on his bathroom mirror for the next 2 years. "You built that. It's not the same thing as being that." Dr. Lang also helped David untangle a harder truth he'd been avoiding, that some of the distance in his marriage predated the business crisis, that he and Sarah had been drifting in small ways for longer than he wanted to admit, and that understanding this wasn't about excusing what she and Robert had done, but about making sure he didn't simply repeat the same patterns in whatever relationship came next. "Betrayal doesn't happen in a vacuum," she told him gently during one session. "That doesn't make it your fault. It just means there's something worth understanding here, for your own sake going forward." Slowly, over the course of about 18 months, David's life began to take a more stable shape. He was promoted at the freight company to operations manager, overseeing a small team, and while the salary still wasn't what he used to earn, it was enough to move out of the apartment above the hardware store and into a modest but clean 2-bedroom place, one with an actual second bedroom for Ethan to stay in comfortably during his visits, decorated with dinosaur sheets Ethan had picked out himself at the store. He rebuilt his relationships too, carefully and deliberately. He reconnected with old college friends he'd lost touch with during the chaos of the business collapse, several of whom, to his surprise, had no interest in judging him for what had happened. If anything, a few of them admitted they'd wondered for years how Robert had really felt about splitting ownership with David in the first place. Hints David had never picked up on before, because he trusted his old friend completely. His relationship with Ethan deepened during this period too. Freed from the 18-hour workdays that had defined his years running the business, David found himself for the first time genuinely present for his son, coaching his youth soccer team on Saturdays, reading to him every night during his custody weeks, learning to cook simple meals so Ethan wouldn't have to survive on takeout during their time together. In a strange way, losing everything had given David something he hadn't had in years: time and the ability to actually be there. He remembered with a kind of quiet pride the first time he successfully made Ethan's favorite meal from scratch. A simple spaghetti with meat sauce that took him 3 failed attempts over as many weekends to get right, burning the garlic the first time, over-salting the sauce the second. When he finally got it right the third time, Ethan had declared it better than Mom's, a comment David knew was probably an exaggeration, born of a 5-year-old's loyalty in the moment, but one that he still thought about warmly years later. Coaching Ethan's soccer team turned out to be an unexpected source of stability too. David had never coached anything in his life, had signed up somewhat reluctantly when the team's usual coach dropped out mid-season and no other parent volunteered, but found that he genuinely enjoyed it. The simplicity of teaching 6-year-olds to pass the ball instead of all chasing it in a single clump. The parents who became genuine friends over folding chairs on the sideline. The pure, uncomplicated joy on Ethan's face whenever David showed up to practice. A joy that had nothing to do with money or status or any of the things David had spent a decade chasing in his old life. Sarah and Robert's relationship, meanwhile, from what little David heard through mutual acquaintances, moved quickly. They were engaged within a year of David and Sarah's divorce being finalized, married about 8 months after that, in what David heard described as a considerably more lavish ceremony than his own wedding to Sarah had been. Robert had used the capital he'd protected from the bankruptcy, along with some family money on his side, to start a new logistics consulting firm, positioning himself as an expert who'd navigated the industry's toughest years. A description David found almost darkly funny, given how that navigation had actually worked out for the people around him. David tried, mostly successfully, not to dwell on it. Dr. Lang had taught him that bitterness was its own kind of prison, one that would keep him tethered to Robert and Sarah's life indefinitely if he let it. It wasn't easy. There were still nights the anger surfaced, sharp and sudden, usually triggered by something small, like seeing Robert's new company mentioned in a regional business journal, or Ethan mentioning some new expensive gift Robert had bought him. But David kept doing the work, kept showing up for his own life instead of measuring it against theirs. Financially, the climb back was slow and unglamorous, nothing like the dramatic rebuilding montages of movies. David set up a strict budget for the first time in his adult life, tracking every expense in a simple spreadsheet, determined never again to be blindsided by numbers the way he had been in the final months of the old business. He paid off his portion of the personal debts that had survived the bankruptcy discharge with a discipline that surprised even him, taking on occasional freelance consulting work on weekends for smaller regional shippers who couldn't afford full-time logistics staff, slowly building a small cushion of savings that felt, after those terrifying months of having nothing, almost sacred to him. He also made a point, once he had even a small amount of financial breathing room, of setting aside money specifically for Ethan's future. A modest college fund that started with embarrassingly small monthly contributions, but that David added to religiously, treating it as a non-negotiable expense rather than an optional extra. A promise to himself that whatever else had gone wrong, his son would never have to watch him scramble the way David had scrambled during those darkest months above the hardware store. By the time Ethan turned 7, David had also started running again, something he'd loved in his 20s before the business consumed every spare hour of his life. He found an early morning route through his neighborhood, quiet streets before the world woke up, and use the time to think, to process, to simply exist without the constant churn of anxiety that had characterized his thoughts for so long. It became, in its own small way, a ritual of reclaiming himself, physically rebuilding strength and discipline in his body that mirrored in some inarticulate way the rebuilding happening everywhere else in his life. It was almost 3 years after the divorce when David met Rachel. She was a supply chain analyst who'd recently transferred to the freight company where David worked, brought in to help modernize their scheduling systems using data analytics. Something David, despite his years of hands-on industry experience, knew relatively little about. Their working relationship started out purely professional. David explaining the practical realities of freight routing that no spreadsheet could fully capture. Rachel showing him how modern software could actually make his instincts more efficient rather than replacing them. Their first real conversation outside of work matters happened almost by accident, during a company-wide meeting that ran long on a Friday afternoon. Both of them, seated near the back of the conference room, had started passing notes back and forth on a shared notepad, cracking dry jokes about the presenter's overuse of the phrase synergistic efficiency. And by the time the meeting finally ended, they'd made each other laugh more in 40 minutes than David had laughed in months. Rachel suggested, almost offhandedly, that they grab a coffee sometime to actually finish the conversation properly, and David, somewhat to his own surprise, said yes without the usual hesitation that had defined his approach to dating since the divorce. Their first actual date several days later was almost derailed by David's nerves. He arrived 15 minutes early to the coffee shop, then panicked and left to walk around the block twice before finally going back in, worried he'd look over-eager. Rachel, arriving exactly on time, found him slightly out of breath and pretending to have just arrived himself, and called him out on it immediately with a raised eyebrow and a knowing smile, which somehow broke the tension immediately and set the tone for the effortless, honest rapport that would come to define their entire relationship. Rachel was different from Sarah in ways David hadn't expected to notice or care about, but did. She was independent almost to a fault, having built her own career from the ground up after putting herself through college while working full-time, with no family safety net to fall back on if things went wrong. She had an easy, unflappable calm about her. David noticed early on that she didn't rattle easily, whether dealing with a frustrated client on the phone or a printer that jammed for the third time in an hour. And after the chaos of his previous years, that steadiness felt like something he could actually lean on. Their relationship developed slowly, almost cautiously on David's part. He was honest with her early on about the wreckage of his past, about the bankruptcy, about Sarah and Robert, worried that the baggage would scare her off. Instead, Rachel listened to the whole story one evening over dinner at her apartment, and when he finished, she simply said, "That explains a lot about why you check the delivery numbers 3 times before you trust them. You don't trust easily anymore, do you?" David admitted that he didn't, not the way he used to. Rachel didn't push him to change that overnight. Instead, over the following months, she simply proved herself, consistently in small ways, showing up when she said she would, being honest even when honesty was inconvenient, never once making him feel like a burden for the difficult years he carried with him. Slowly, almost without David fully realizing it was happening, the walls he'd built after Sarah's betrayal began to come down. One moment stood out to David as particularly meaningful, months into their relationship. He'd had a genuinely bad day at work. A shipment had gone missing, a client was furious, and David had spent the entire afternoon fielding angry phone calls. The kind of stress that used to remind him uncomfortably of the final months of his old business. He'd texted Rachel to cancel their dinner plans, expecting understanding, but also a small note of disappointment, the way these things usually went. Instead, Rachel had shown up at his apartment 40 minutes later with takeout from his favorite Thai place and a 6-pack of the beer he liked, saying simply, "You don't have to be good company tonight. I just didn't want you sitting here by yourself after a day like that." It was such a small gesture, objectively. Takeout and beer, nothing more. But David sat on his couch that night, eating pad thai in comfortable silence, next to a woman who'd shown up specifically because he was having a hard time, not despite it, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt secure in for years. The sense that he could be struggling, visibly and honestly, without it costing him the relationship. Ethan liked her too, which mattered enormously to David. Rachel never tried to insert herself as a replacement parent or to compete for Ethan's affection. She simply showed genuine interest in whatever 8-year-old Ethan was excited about that week, whether it was dinosaurs, a video game, or the youth soccer team David still coached. Watching the two of them build their own easy rapport, completely separate from David's relationship with either of them, was one of the things that finally convinced David this relationship was different from anything he'd experienced before. Around the same time David's relationship with Rachel was deepening, news began filtering back to him, through Ethan, through old mutual friends, through the small world nature of the regional logistics industry, that things weren't going as smoothly for Robert and Sarah as their lavish wedding might have suggested. Robert's new consulting firm, it turned out, had been built more on charisma and old connections than on any particularly sound business fundamentals. The same fundamentals David had actually been the one to master over their years running the company together, a fact that became apparent to former clients fairly quickly once Robert was operating without David's operational expertise behind him. 2 significant client contracts fell through within the firm's second year, and rumors began circulating that Robert had taken on more personal debt than was wise to fund the firm's expansion. David heard some of the details secondhand from a former colleague who'd briefly consulted for Robert's new firm before leaving in frustration. Apparently, Robert had overpromised capabilities the firm simply didn't have, claiming expertise in specialized cold chain logistics for a major grocery client, a niche neither Robert nor his small new team actually understood in any real depth. The kind of niche David himself had spent years learning firsthand on loading docks and in supplier negotiations. The grocery contract collapsed within 4 months, taking a significant chunk of the firm's projected revenue with it, and word of the failure spread quickly enough in the tight-knit regional industry to make new client acquisition considerably harder going forward. Then came the detail that David heard about almost by accident, from Ethan of all people, who mentioned it casually one weekend without any sense of how significant it actually was. "Robert's been really stressed lately. Mom says he's working all the time now, just like you used to." The parallel wasn't lost on David. History, it seemed, was rhyming in an uncomfortable way for Sarah. The same pattern of a husband consumed by a struggling business, increasingly absent, increasingly stressed, was repeating itself, except this time David wasn't the one on the receiving end of her frustration. A mutual acquaintance later told David, somewhat carefully, that Sarah had confided to a friend that she felt like she was living the same nightmare twice, except this time with a man who, unlike David all those years ago, didn't seem particularly interested in fighting to save what they'd built together. Robert, by most accounts, had already begun looking for an exit strategy from both the business and, eventually, the marriage. There was, David later learned, a particular irony to how it all unfolded. Sarah, feeling the same isolation and financial anxiety she'd felt during David's crisis years earlier, apparently reached out to an old friend from her original marketing night classes for support. A man named Marcus, recently divorced himself, who'd remained a steady, sympathetic presence during the worsening months of Robert's business troubles. Whether anything had actually happened between them, David never learned for certain, and frankly didn't care to dig deeper. But the symmetry of it, if even partially true, struck him as almost too fitting to be coincidence. The exact pattern that had once ended his own marriage now circling back around Sarah's second one. David felt a complicated mix of emotions when he heard all this. Not quite satisfaction, though he wasn't proud to admit a small, human part of him did feel a flicker of something like vindication. Mostly, though, he felt a strange kind of clarity. The version of stability Sarah had chosen over him, the plan she'd cited as her reason for leaving, had turned out to be built on the same kind of shaky foundation as what she'd left behind. Except this time without even the years of genuine partnership and shared history David had actually given her. He mentioned all of this to Dr. Lang during one of their sessions, half expecting her to gently redirect him away from what felt, even to David, like dwelling on his ex-wife's misfortune more than was healthy. Instead, she asked him a simple question that reframed the whole thing for him. "What does knowing all of this actually change about your life right now today?" David sat with the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "Nothing, really. It didn't get him his old business back. It didn't undo the months in the apartment above the hardware store. It was simply information, interesting in a distant, almost academic way, about a life he no longer had any real stake in. That realization, more than the news about Robert's struggles itself, marked something of a genuine turning point for David. He noticed in the months that followed that he thought about Sarah and Robert less and less. Not because he'd made some heroic effort to stop, but because his own life had simply become full enough. With Rachel, with Ethan, with the slow, steady rebuilding of his career, that there was less empty space left for old grievances to occupy. The story of what had happened to him stopped being the main narrative of his life and became instead simply one chapter among many, its weight naturally diminishing as new chapters accumulated on top of it. 2 years into his relationship with Rachel, David proposed. It wasn't an elaborate, publicly staged event. He'd learned, through everything he'd survived, that the grandest gestures don't necessarily mean the most. Instead, he asked her on an ordinary Tuesday evening, in the kitchen of the house they'd recently bought together, a modest but comfortable place with a yard big enough for the dog Ethan had been begging for, while she was still in her work clothes, tired from a long day, laughing at something silly Ethan had said at dinner. David simply took her hand, told her that after everything he'd lost, she taught him what it actually felt like to build something with someone who showed up consistently without condition, and asked if she'd keep showing up for the rest of their lives. Rachel, characteristically unflappable, laughed through happy tears and said yes before he'd even fully finished the sentence, then immediately turned to Ethan, still sitting at the table with a mouthful of dinner, and asked, half joking, half serious, "Is this okay with you? You're kind of the most important vote here." Ethan, 12 years old by then, and fully aware of the significance of the moment, had simply grinned and said, "Took you guys long enough," which became something of a family joke, repeated at nearly every gathering for years afterward. Their wedding, when it happened about a year later, was small and warm. Close friends, Rachel's tight-knit family, and Ethan, now 10 years old, serving as the ring bearer with an enormous sense of self-importance about the job. It was held in a small botanical garden just outside Columbus, chosen specifically because it was unpretentious and quiet. Nothing like the large, expensive venue David and Sarah had used for their own wedding years earlier. David remembered standing at the altar, watching Rachel walk toward him, and feeling an overwhelming sense not of excitement exactly, but of arrival. The feeling of a man who had been through a genuine storm and had finally, deliberately, built something solid enough to weather whatever came next. At the reception, David gave a short toast, and though he didn't mention Sarah or Robert by name, he said something that stuck with everyone who'd known him through the hardest years. "I used to think losing everything was the worst thing that could happen to a person. I know now it was actually the thing that showed me what mattered enough to rebuild." His mother, sitting in the front row, cried openly through the entire toast, having watched her son go from the lowest point of his life to this moment over the course of several difficult years, and later told him privately that she genuinely worried during those darkest months in the apartment above the hardware store, whether he would ever find his way back to himself. Today, David runs his own small logistics consulting practice again, smaller and more deliberately scaled than his original company, built this time on lessons learned the hard way about partnership agreements, financial safeguards, and perhaps most importantly, about trusting his own judgment about people. He's financially stable, not wealthy in the way the old business once promised to make him, but secure in a way that feels more durable, built on skills and relationships he trusts completely. Ethan, now a teenager, splits his time between David and Rachel's home and Sarah's, and by all accounts has grown into a thoughtful, grounded kid who seems to have inherited his father's steadiness more than the instability of the years surrounding the divorce. As for Sarah and Robert, their marriage didn't survive the business troubles that followed Robert's consulting firm eventually folding under its debt. They divorced roughly 4 years after their own wedding, a divorce that, by the accounts David heard secondhand, was considerably more contentious than his and Sarah's had been, given the debts involved and Robert's evident reluctance to shoulder financial responsibility for the failed venture. David never gloated about any of it, not even privately. Dr. Lang's old lesson about bitterness being its own prison had stuck with him permanently. But he did notice, with a quiet sense of peace rather than triumph, that the life he'd rebuilt from absolutely nothing had turned out sturdier than the one Sarah thought she was choosing when she walked out that terrible night. A few years after his wedding to Rachel, David found himself in an unexpected role. Mentor, a young man named Tyler, barely 26, had started his own small freight brokerage out of a spare bedroom in his apartment and had reached out to David through a mutual industry contact, hoping for some informal advice from someone who'd actually built a company in the same space. David almost said no at first. Some part of him still flinched at the idea of getting close to the industry that had once cost him so much. But something about Tyler's earnest, slightly overwhelmed energy reminded David of himself at that same age, sketching ideas on napkins with more enthusiasm than caution, and he agreed to meet for coffee. What started as a single conversation turned into a standing monthly meeting. David found himself, almost to his own surprise, genuinely enjoying the process of walking Tyler through the mistakes he himself had made. The importance of ironclad partnership agreements, the danger of commingling personal and business finances without clear boundaries, the value of diversifying a client base so no single account could sink the entire operation the way that one bankrupt manufacturer had very nearly sunk Whitman and Hayes all those years ago. He was careful never to frame these lessons around Robert directly, not wanting to turn mentorship into an airing of old grievances. But the underlying wisdom was, unmistakably, hard-won from his own experience of watching a trusted partner protect himself at David's expense. "Get everything in writing, even with people you'd trust with your life," David told Tyler during one of their early sessions. "Especially with people you'd trust with your life. Honestly, trust is exactly what makes people skip the paperwork, and skipping the paperwork is exactly what gets people hurt when things go sideways." Tyler's business over the following 2 years grew steadily and, more importantly, sustainably. He took David's advice about structuring things carefully seriously, building in safeguards that David himself had never thought to establish back when he and Robert first shook hands over a business plan sketched on the back of a napkin decades earlier. Watching Tyler succeed, avoiding the specific pitfalls David had fallen into, gave David a quiet, unexpected sense of closure. It didn't undo what had happened to him, but it gave the experience a kind of second purpose, proof that something useful could be built out of even his worst years if he was willing to hand that hard-earned knowledge forward to someone else. Rachel noticed the change in him during this period too, a lightness that hadn't quite been there before, even in the relatively settled years since their marriage. "You talk about the old business differently now," she observed one evening, as David got off the phone with Tyler after a particularly encouraging update about a new contract Tyler had successfully negotiated using exactly the kind of protective clauses David had recommended. "Less like a wound, more like a story you're actually okay having lived through." David thought about that for a long moment before answering. "I think that's exactly what it is now," he said. "It stopped being the thing that happened to me somewhere along the way. It just became part of how I got here." By the time Ethan turned 16, he had grown into the kind of thoughtful, steady young man that both David and, to her credit, Sarah had worked hard to raise, even amid all the turbulence of his early childhood. He'd inherited David's analytical mind, and according to more than one family friend, Sarah's easy warmth with people, an unusual combination that made him well-liked among both his peers and adults alike. It was around this age that Ethan first asked David directly about the divorce, not the sanitized, age-appropriate version he'd been given as a young child, but the real story, the one involving Robert and the business and the specific timeline of betrayal that David had always been careful to shield him from in earlier years. They were driving back from a soccer tournament 2 states over, several hours alone in the car, when Ethan finally worked up the nerve to ask. "Did Mom leave because of the money or because of Robert?" he asked, staring out the passenger window rather than at his father. The kind of question a teenager asks when he's been turning it over privately for a long time before finally voicing it. David took a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. This was a conversation he'd rehearsed in his head many times over the years, anticipating the day Ethan would be old enough to ask it directly, but it still felt different actually living through it. Honestly, Bud, I think it was both, tangled up together, he said. The business failing scared her. I wasn't around much those last couple years trying to save it, and I think she felt really alone. Robert was there, and he made her feel less alone. I'm not saying that makes what happened okay. It doesn't, not to me. But I don't think it's quite as simple as her just choosing money over me. I think it was more complicated and sadder than that. Ethan was quiet for a while, processing this. Do you still hate them? He finally asked. Mom and Robert? I did for a long time, David admitted. Robert especially. Losing a business partner and a best friend in the same breath as losing my marriage, that was a lot to be angry about all at once. But I don't carry that around much anymore. Being angry at them stopped actually costing them anything a long time ago. It was really only costing me. That's kind of a therapist thing to say, Ethan said, with the particular dry humor he'd developed as a teenager. And David laughed, genuinely, because it absolutely was. A nearly verbatim echo of something Dr. Lang had told him years earlier, distilled now into something he could pass on to his son in an ordinary car ride home from a soccer tournament, folded so completely into how David actually thought that he didn't even notice he was quoting someone else anymore. Guess it stuck, David said. For what it's worth, I'm glad you asked. I'd rather you know the real version than piece together some half story from things you overhear. Ethan nodded, seeming satisfied, and the conversation drifted naturally to lighter things. The tournament, a girl in his class he was clearly interested in, but wouldn't quite admit to, plans for the upcoming summer. But David noticed, in the weeks that followed, a subtle shift in how Ethan talked about both households. A little more openness, a little less of the careful, diplomatic neutrality he'd maintained for years, as if some structural understanding had finally clicked into place for him, allowing him to hold the whole complicated truth of his family history without it destabilizing him. Sarah, for her part, when she eventually learned that David had spoken openly with Ethan about the full history, called David directly, something she rarely did outside of logistical co-parenting matters. Thank you for not making me out to be a villain to him, she said, her voice carrying an unusual vulnerability David hadn't heard from her in years. I told him the truth, Sarah, David replied evenly. Not a version designed to make either of us look good or bad. He's old enough for that now. I think we both owe him that much, honestly, whatever went wrong between us. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the more meaningful exchanges David and Sarah had had since the divorce. Not a reconciliation, not even really a warm moment, but a kind of mutual recognition that whatever bitterness remained between them, they were still, both of them, trying to do right by the son they'd made together, even years after everything else between them had fallen apart. It happened at Ethan's high school graduation, of all places, the kind of event where the fractured pieces of a family are more or less forced to occupy the same bleachers for a few uncomfortable hours, smiling for photos, trying to make the day about the graduate rather than about the tangled adult history sitting in the audience. David hadn't seen Robert in person in nearly a decade. He recognized him immediately across the parking lot afterward. Older now, grayer, noticeably heavier than the sharp, confident man David remembered from their partnership years, dressed in a suit that looked slightly too formal for the occasion. The kind of overcompensation David recognized instantly from his own hardest years, when appearing put together, had felt like the last line of defense against everyone seeing how badly things had actually fallen apart. Robert saw him too, and for a long, awkward moment, neither man moved. Ethan, oblivious to the tension, was several yards away, taking photos with his friends, giving the two of them an unplanned, unwanted moment alone. Finally, Robert crossed the distance between them, hand extended somewhat tentatively. David, he said, it's been a long time. David looked at the offered hand for a moment before shaking it, more out of not wanting to make a scene at his son's graduation than any genuine warmth. Robert, he's a good kid, Robert said, nodding toward Ethan. You did a good job with him. We both did a lot of things over the years, David replied evenly, not quite able to keep a small edge out of his voice, though he tried. But yeah, he turned out good. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. Robert shifted his weight, glanced down at the pavement, and then, unexpectedly, said something David hadn't anticipated at all. I owe you an apology, a real one, not just an awkward handshake at a graduation. What I did, using what I knew about the finances to protect myself while you went down with the company, and everything with Sarah on top of it, that wasn't just bad business. That was a betrayal of 20 years of friendship, and I've had a long time to sit with how badly I handled all of it. David studied him for a moment, searching for insincerity, and somewhat to his surprise, not immediately finding any. Whatever had happened to Robert in the intervening years, the failed consulting firm, the divorce from Sarah, whatever quieter humiliations had accompanied both, seemed to have worn down some of the polished self-assurance David remembered, leaving something more raw and, oddly, more honest in its place. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's all fine," David said carefully. "It's not, and it never fully will be. You were my best friend for 20 years before any of that happened, Robert. And what you did cost me more than just money. It cost me trusting my own judgment about people for a long time afterward. That doesn't just go away because you're sorry now, all these years later." "I know," Robert said quietly. "I'm not asking you to say it's fine. I just needed you to actually hear it from me, finally, instead of me just letting it sit there unsaid forever." David nodded slowly, something in his chest loosening slightly that he hadn't fully realized was still tight after all these years. "All right," he said. "I hear you." They didn't hug, didn't promise to rebuild the friendship, didn't pretend the conversation had magically repaired 2 decades of history in 90 seconds in a high school parking lot. But when Ethan came jogging back over a few minutes later, phone full of graduation photos, both men were still standing there, talking in the low, careful tones of people navigating something genuinely difficult, rather than the icy silence that had defined their every prior interaction since the divorce. Later that evening, telling Rachel about the encounter over dinner, David found himself surprised by his own reaction to it. "I thought I'd feel angrier running into him like that," he admitted, "or like I needed to say something sharp, get some kind of last word in. But mostly I just felt like it was done. Like a chapter that had been left open way too long finally got to close properly." Rachel reached across the table and took his hand. "That's what real closure usually looks like, I think," she said. "Not fireworks, just quiet, and then a little less weight to carry around afterward." David thought about that for the rest of the evening, and in the weeks that followed, noticed that he genuinely did feel lighter. Not because Robert's apology had undone any of the damage from those terrible years, but because he no longer had to carry the unfinished business of it quite so heavily. Some wounds he'd come to understand slowly over the years don't need the other person to fix them in order to heal. But every once in a while, when the other person actually did show up and try, it made the healing a little more complete anyway.